Aloha mai kako and ikomo mai. A warm greeting to all of you here today at the Burns Hall at the East West Center in Honolulu, Hawaii. And for those of you joining us from around the world online, thank you for zooming in. And so for those of you who don't know me, I'm Susie Var-Islam, president of the East West Center, and it is my pleasure and honor to welcome all of you here today for our special presentation, The Future of Climate Diplomacy, featuring Consul General Paul Rennie. Many thanks to the Consular Corps of Hawaii and many of you here today, and the British Consul General in Los Angeles, who are co-hosting today's talk. And a few quick housekeeping notes. Restrooms and water fountains are just down the hall to your left here. And this talk, again, for those online and those of you who want to share, will be recorded and will be available on our East West Center's YouTube channel. And now, with the person you've been waiting for, but before that, I will turn it over to our fantastic event partner, Honorary Consul General Midori Akamine, to help introduce our esteemed speaker. Over to you, Midori. Thank you.
Thank you. Aloha, everyone, and good afternoon. Thank you for coming out today. It's my pleasure to introduce Consul General Paul Rennie. He is the serving British consul in Los Angeles. He is the senior representative of the UK government in Southern California, Arizona, Nevada, Utah, Hawaii, the US territories of American Samoa and Guam, and the Commonwealth of the Northern Marianas Islands. That's a very large remit. His role includes the promotion of trade and investment, scientific cooperation, tackling climate change, creative and media collaborations, and educational partnerships between the UK and the US Southwest. He also oversees delivery of essential consular services to a 600,000 strong British resident community and British visitors. He was previously at the US Embassy, and one of the reasons why we are so happy to have him here is in that role, he was managing the energy and climate team at the Embassy, delivering collaborations from the UK into the US. So we're very pleased to have him here, and I'd like to now pass the mic to Paul.
Well, first of all, a huge thank you, Susie, to you and the team and Honourable East West Centre for having made this possible today. It is a new arrival for me and a very new partnership, but I look forward to many more opportunities. Well, I don't know if everyone else is looking forward to more opportunities for me to speak, but I'm looking for more collaborations to work with you in the East West Centre today. It's going to be absolutely fantastic. So thank you to your team and thank you to everyone today as well in the room who's made the effort to come here today. So I wanted to talk a bit about the future of climate diplomacy. And I always think if you want to look forward on anything, it's often important to look back a little bit to see where you've come from. The question can sometimes be, how far back do you need to look? Because when it comes to climate change, we look back on quite a lot of data to understand where we're trying to get to in the future. But if you're trying to look back at climate negotiations, how far back do you need to get to understand what's going to happen next? Because for many people, if you ask what were some of the foundational moments in the climate journey, they look back to 1979 and the first World Climate Conference in Geneva. Here, scientists from over 50 nations agreed that the alarming trends in carbon dioxide emissions required urgent action in 1979. This led to the establishment, as many people know, of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, in 1988, which really began the first organised international collaboration on climate change. But is that really where we should begin? Because if you look back even further to the late Bronze Age, around 3,000 years ago, there's evidence of a prolonged drought that contributed to systems collapse and conflict across Mediterranean civilizations. This resulted in the exchange of diplomatic letters between kingdoms. You can tell as a diplomat some tools haven't changed in 3,000 years. And treaties between the Hittites and the Egyptians discussing grain transfers. And even sooner than that, in the Little Ice Age, around 700 years ago, there were bitter winters and mild summers, putting huge pressures on agricultural production. Again, climate-induced negotiation came to the fore with trade agreements between the Hanseatic League cities, local peace treaties between communities over grazing rights, and agreements between monasteries for food distribution. So you can see that 1979 was not our first attempt to get it right. But of course, the key difference since then has been the understanding of the globalized nature of the threat. It was why the 1992 Earth Summit in Rio was rightly seen as another watershed moment, producing the UNFCCC framework and establishing the basic understanding of common but differentiated treatment. And from there to 1997, the Kyoto Protocol and the first legally binding international treaty on emission reductions. It was imperfect. Not all major emitters would ratify the treaty, but it was another step forward as we began to understand how negotiations could and should work. And then into the 2000s, data became a much bigger part of how we understood work. The evidence began to mount of human-induced climate change, but it also saw a shift in global conditions as major new emerging and developing countries like Brazil, India, and China began to play an increasingly critical role in how we would understand climate negotiations, which in turn, as the data grew, put a lot more pressure on the need for climate action amongst our populations. But it also brought more challenges of how we balanced rights and responsibilities in a modern age. The 2009 Copenhagen Conference, or COP15, first introduced the kind of goal of limiting global temperature rise to no more than 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, and also established the first Green Climate Fund. But it also missed its target of a new global treaty as divisions between developed and developing countries began to emerge. It would take the 2015 Paris Agreement to offer the next shift of approach with a bottom-up structure, and nations submitting their own climate pledges, the nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, and also established a new framework of climate finance, of adaptation, and a regular review of these committees. And with the 2021 Glasgow Pact, it was the first explicit mention of fossil fuels in a COP agreement. And all of that brings us right up to date. Last month, COP29, and the agreement to mobilise at least $300 billion of climate finance by 2035 for developing countries. Much of this money is coming from multilateral development banks, but with countries like the UK also looking to do more in wider areas, such as countering deforestation and scaling up private finance. But if all of that to today is the past of climate diplomacy, what does the future hold? What of the future would feel familiar to our Hittites of 3,000 years ago? And what would feel very different as they take things forward? For me, the first and perhaps sad reality about the future of negotiations is the impact of climate change is going to become even more clear. It is one thing to sit around a negotiating table with charts and statistics and data, but it's something completely different when you see your own home has become uninsurable because of flood risk, when you see your crops are wiped out by drought or wildfires, or you see schools are routinely cancelled because of the smog. And as horrendous as those realities might be, even the Hittites would have understood that public recognition of a challenge creates the diplomatic space for negotiations to create change. And this is particularly true when that change requires trade-offs and cost, which I think is the second reality of future negotiations. There are going to be more choices and more costs. A good deal of that cost will be financial. The transition to ways of living and working and producing that are less carbon intensive costs money. And not all of those who are emitting right now have the means to pay, whether as individuals or at a national level. So who will pay? Because people think they're already paying for lots of things right now, for schools, for hospitals, for the military. Yet we pay for all of these things because we see the benefits we get from them outweigh the cost. Britain's Prime Minister made exactly that point at COP29 when he said, "There is no national security without climate security." And our Secretary of State for Energy Security and Net Zero followed that up in Parliament by saying, "It is precisely because Britain represents only 1% of annual global emissions that we have to work with others to ensure the remaining 99% of emissions are addressed to protect the British people." We have to make that case globally for the benefits of investment to protect people's daily lives. But it won't just be about the money in future negotiations. It will also be about the technology. The UK has led the way in the installation of offshore wind and is about to usher in a new generation of nuclear power. There are advances too in the realm of carbon capture and storage, solar panels, fusion energy, but also more mundane things like grid management or energy efficiency in the homes. And in future negotiations, we'll need to ensure that those technologies and the supply chains that go with them are available to all who need them. Ultimately, the planet doesn't care about who is emitting that ton of carbon. So mitigation for one is mitigation for all. And data too in that journey is going to become even more crucial. Just as through the 2000s we had breakthrough in our data and understanding, much of that result so far has been focused on the quantum of the change and how we take that forward. But as we implement those changes, we will need to know now if people are living up to the promises they've made. That means a clear understanding through the data of who is emitting and when, who is harming biodiversity and where, and who is paying for their emissions and how much. It will require different kinds of approaches, different kinds of data gathering, not least as new carbon markets and new trading systems start to come online. People will want to know they're getting what they paid for. And perhaps most importantly of all, future climate negotiations may be less about national governments. It would have been impossible for the Egyptians to have imagined when they treated with the Hittites that Memphis and Thebes had set up some parallel negotiations with Atusha and Kadesh. And yet today, the work of local actors and local governments plays one of the most significant roles in tackling climate change. So too that of companies, of civil societies, of the public at large as activists or consumers or voters. At best, it means governments should be able to ride the wave of that change as consumers vote with their pocketbooks for cheaper, greener energy, or as companies respond to investor pressure to electrify their delivery fleets. Even for those who remain sceptical of the urgency or the need, who wouldn't want to spend $1,000 on insulation to save $5,000 on a heating bill? And likewise, with these explosions of new technologies, new jobs will come with it, but we will need new skills to fully realise the opportunity. It will create a pathway for nations to leapfrog old technologies to new, but only if the benefits are shared and the governments can support the private sector to deliver them. Because this change in who is in charge of these negotiations will also put more pressure on governments themselves. The impact of climate change will not be felt equally, any more than the benefits of economic growth have been felt equally. And the governments who do sit together round the negotiating table will find they face different levels of public urgency and domestic urgency to act, but also different kinds of domestic constraints in what they can agree to. The challenge, as it has always been throughout the history of these climate conversations, is how to get that balance right, how to get the trade-offs right between what you offer and what you receive, and how to keep public support on your side to act before it is too late. But in drawing all of this together, and having spent more than 2 decades involved in these kinds of negotiations one way or the other, I remain an optimist. And I'm an optimist for no other reason than more people are aware of and engaging on this debate than ever before. When I was much younger, I remember the visceral fear that would stalk the school playground about the hole in the ozone layer, and the deeply clunky graphics that would appear on television telling us we were all doomed to the sun's irradiation. And as a kid in Scotland, very far north on planet Earth, that bubble of the ozone seemed to come much faster to me than it did to my friends and colleagues in England. So you're very focused on the hole in the ozone layer. I couldn't have passed the chemistry test back then to save my life, but I could absolutely have told you what a chlorofluorocarbon was and why it was a bad thing. Today, 197 countries outlaw the use of CFCs, and the ozone layer seems to be recovering. It gives me hope. And a hope not least that with the next generation, who will ultimately be taking on these negotiations from me and voting on tools to make the change, that these generations will approach the climate change discussion with even more knowledge, with even greater collaboration, and critically, with even deeper empathy about how everyone else on the planet is involved in the need for the change and what they can achieve. And between all of that, I think you have the critical ingredients we will need to solve where we began, the future of climate diplomacy. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Well, thank you so much, Paul. I so appreciate your insights, and I remember the ozone.
The ozone layer, yes.
Yes, and no more hairspray.
Correct.
That was the thing,
Yes,
right? Oh no,
well.
when you're a young girl, it's like, oh no, no more hairspray. But I remember that change, and wonderful discussion. Thank you so much for sharing your insights. And having the UK here present in the region, you have been in the past since you went back into history. Here in Hawaii too, we have such a great connection, and I'm so glad that you were able to see that connection here, as well as in the Pacific.
Yes.
And when you talk about climate and you talk about the Pacific, I know the first thing that comes to mind is, it's rapidly impacting the Pacific, and we'll see many of these atolls with rising sea levels. They will be the ones impacted the most quickly. And so some of those conversations about climate adaptation, climate mitigation, and of course response to natural disasters. In the Pacific, we have the most intense natural disasters, and we've seen that with many of our Pacific Island countries as well as around the world. But I wondered if you could comment a little bit about that connection you talked about as the work that you've been doing and what you've seen around the world, and maybe just comment on that connection to the Pacific from where you're sitting.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's obviously interesting coming from the UK because as an island in the UK, we are kind of the owners of most of our own problems. So if we have flooding that affects households in Britain because rivers burst their banks, the river started in Britain because we're the island. It's different if you're in continental Europe or elsewhere where these rivers can travel over many borders before they create the impact. And likewise in the UK, we are also home to other island communities within our island. So as a Scot myself, any number of Scottish islands that extend hundreds of miles off the coast. And how you work with different communities, because it's very clear to me when you think about these issues that everybody has their own type of solution that works with their culture. So it's not the case you can kind of arrive. And I think sometimes this is the challenge, if I'm honest, that as diplomats, when we get together and do climate negotiations, we've come from a very particular school of thought. Often you've gone through these round after round after round, and sometimes it becomes almost like a debating competition that you're like, well, can I get the text in? And let's recycle last year's text because we all agreed on that, and it's now very hard to agree on next year's text. And sometimes in that journey, you lose sight of the individual human journey in the story. The fishers in Scotland who have far better understandings of the migratory patterns and the impact on rising temperatures in the ocean because they see there are fewer fish literally in the sea. And I think being able to work with local communities and understanding how they are engaging, and I think particularly in the Pacific, with so many island communities, each one of which very proud of its own cultural journey, its own legacy, its own connections, I think it means we can talk more about building from the bottom up than simply creating top-down structures. But at the same time, not acquiescing the responsibility to raise the money and financing needed to support that. So I think this is how you have to balance the two journeys, is both creating space for local collaboration, engagement, and buy-in to their solutions, while providing the right kind of technology, financial means, and kind of oversight of kind of support that they can take advantage.
No, thanks for that. Local community to me also that means the indigenous knowledge and traditional knowledge, if I might be able to add that, that traditional knowledge of that fisherman in that village in the UK, along with the indigenous knowledge that we saw here in Hawaii with Festival of Pacific Arts and Culture, where we saw that celebration or presentations of dance and chanting were reciting some of that preservation of that knowledge that's passed on, just like those fishermen in those villages. So there is, I think, a different way that we can approach and look at that. But I want to turn it over to take some questions from the audience. And for those of you online, you go ahead and start. I've got an iPad right here, so I'll see your questions if you provide them. And for those of you in person, if you don't mind raising your hand, and Anna, thank you so much, Anna and Michael, for your help and assistance today. They will bring the microphone to you, and if you could just tell us your name and where you're from and ask your question to the Consul General, and we'll try to get through as many questions as we can. Let's try to make this a discussion, but if you could actually, I know there's temptation often to make a large speech and then ask the question. So if you could ask the question and then you can follow up later with your context, that would be great. So,
I'll meet you.
But yes. So, right here, Celeste, and then Dennis. So we'll start here first.
So I thought I would jump right in. Celeste Connors with Hawaiʻi Green Growth, just because it builds on something, Paul, thank you so much for your remarks, and Susie, that you said about islands. And then building on a bit further, when you think about the hole in the ozone and that time bound or the urgency, and then we have this 2030 goal, right, that you mentioned, the island in mind. How do you think islands actually are best positioned, not just as victims of climate change, but because these trade-offs might be happening quicker with islands that have goals and how things might be piling on top of each other because of limited land? But where do you see islands emerging as leaders, areas of innovation with specific examples maybe that you've seen in the UK or even in Hawaii since you've been here? Thank you.
Sure. So, so many interesting and different ways. And I mean, Hawaii, for example, very interestingly, about how its power comes, how its energy comes. Hawaii is a long way from a nuclear reactor for very good reasons, but the point is it's not as if there's an external energy source that's just waiting to supply Hawaii with gigawatts and gigawatts of power. So the kind of context in Hawaii, as it is for many of the Scottish islands, is, well, how do we generate power for ourselves? Because the one thing that's absolutely certain is we're all using more energy than ever before. I mean, it seems like we're saving lots of power because, our phone batteries last for longer and we're driving electric vehicles and so on. But every new data center that's powering your Netflix account requires massive amounts of power and energy to make it work. And I think as an island, particularly somewhere like Hawaii, thinking around, well, how do I generate the optimum amount of power? Because it's not always just about how can I generate the most unlimited amount of energy I need. It's how do I optimize that? How do I get the right kinds of technology onto my grid system? How do I get the right balance between different kinds? It's not a case you just want wind or just want solar. You want a balanced grid to help make that work. But also, how does the energy efficiency journey come into that? How am I ensuring that the kind of utilization of the power is in the most efficient way here? And we think a lot about that when I was in the UK because, we have these great electric vehicles. The solution for the planet isn't to swap every internal combustion engine for an electric vehicle. That's not the solution. The solution is also partly around better public transport. We want people making fewer car journeys, so there are fewer vehicles to consume fewer resources, but still enable people to access and engage with the community and their lives around them. And I think it can be difficult sometimes to visualize that at a continental scale. If you're working across 27 European nations trying to integrate the grid system there, you're working across the whole of the United States or the Americas as a whole. But as an island community, you can actually pioneer a whole solution, that you have the whole ecosystem at your fingertips. And I think critically as well, being able to activate the community engagement to deliver. And to your point exactly, Susie, the islands understand their problems better than anyone else. The indigenous knowledge that comes from here, it is, and it's funny because in Scotland we have something that we call the old wives' tales. The stories that your grandmother told you about a thing, about a thing, about a thing. And it was often like weird herbal remedies for things. And actually, oddly enough, they tend to work better than taking your kind of ibuprofen or other bits like that. So I think a lot of that knowledge that has been passed down is not always as well respected internationally because it's not being written. Sometimes, and I think this is the challenge for me with the climate journey, sometimes the more scientific and the more data heavy it feels, the more true it must be. Whereas a lot of the knowledge we need to solve our problems is often not written down, it's passed down through generations. And again, from an island perspective, Celeste, that the ability to harness indigenous community knowledge, the best international practice, create a single ecosystem that solves the problem, could be the best demonstrator we ever have on how you solve the kind of island of planet Earth.
Thank you, thank you. Thank you to CEO of Hawaii Green Growth. And before we go to the Honorary Consul General for Germany, if we could hold on, I'm just going to go online. Oh, sorry, yes. We do have a question all the way from the University of Edinburgh.
Oh, great.
So, yeah.
My alma mater.
Yes,
So,
yes.
this will be a tough one.
Yes.
They're great people from the university.
Yes, Cassie Shan. So Cassie asked, what do you feel should be the primary focus of British diplomats when looking to support other nations tackle the issues of climate change?
So, sounds a bit daft. The primary focus should be to listen. To listen.
That's great, right? Because there's too much talking.
There is.
And we have 2 ears and 1 mouth, so we should listen.
And so, from my perspective, the biggest role I play out here is to listen, to learn. I mean, I've spent a wonderful couple of days here in Hawaii going to visit things like agrivoltaics and some literally world-leading research into how agrivoltaics is working here on the island of Hawaii. Not somewhere in kind of Central Europe or Central America. It's like right here in Hawaii it's happening. And likewise, some of the coral reef restoration we saw today on the Turtle Island, is that right? Is incredible, just incredible to see that. And so from my perspective, the biggest role we face is learning and listening. And then also, how do we engage where the UK can add value? So the UK has world-leading researchers. I mean, that's one of our great global strengths. But they may not themselves be able to travel and do what I do to see opportunities. And I think, again, being able to kind of come and listen to what is happening, to come and see what is happening, to take my kind of understanding back to the UK and say, who is interested in a collaboration here? Who wants to kind of collaborate with a community here or a university there to share understanding and share knowledge? And again, the UK is a science hub as a global gateway for that. So we don't just have British scientists, we bring scientists from around the world to some of our leading research institutions. I think for me that is the primary goal, because the UK has both a significant voice in the world. We are a permanent member of the UN Security Council. We have a permanent seat for the World Bank in terms of our shareholding in the IMF. So we have access and reach into a lot of these international vehicles that we can help to support messages. But we have to understand those messages when they come. So it sounds a little bit trite to say, I think listening and learning is the most important thing a diplomat can do. But
well, no, I think that's important, because maybe if more people did that, we'd be more effective. But I also see the way I'm just distilling down what you're saying is you're really a key bridge. Yes. But in order to be that key bridge, you have to have your ears open and your mind open.
Yes, yes, the latter most importantly.
Yes, right. No, but thank you. Thank you for asking that question, Cassie. And now turn over to you.
Hi, Dennis Ali, Honorary Consul for Germany. Very warm welcome to Hawaii, Consul. Being from Germany, I have, of course, witnessed very harsh and long discussions on the nature of climate change mitigation through technology and through other means, conservation, etc. And not everything turns out the way you started. And I was wondering if you could share some of your experience from the United Kingdom as to the obstacles in the discussion and the current status in the maybe public opinion as well as in the forward thrust to actually do something.
Yeah. So I think one of the big advantages we have in the UK is this is no longer a partisan issue. You know, both sides of the UK political, both sides, all 3 or 4 sides of the UK political spectrum are agreed on the need to act. And I think that's a huge boost for us. So, you know, not every country has that certainty around we need to take steps, we need to take action. And I think the second thing is that the way I would, over the last 20 or 30 years looking at this, my sense is that the climate debate has now moved into what I would call the big leagues of policy. What do I mean by that? Is, 25 years ago, this was about more recycling bins. This was kind of what the debate was. Like, people met in Kyoto and elsewhere, and then you came back and they're like, oh, I've installed more recycling bins in the office. I'm doing my part. And energy efficient engines would come in the UK because we largely put up gas prices and taxes. And so we drove efficiency through that system. But you weren't making some of the really difficult choices that came with that. So things like your policy on defence or education has always been in what I'd say is the big leagues, because you have genuinely hard trade-offs, expensive trade-offs that people have to make. And I think the big thing facing the UK now is as we move into the kind of final yards, we're getting into these big and complicated choices. So the UK government has committed to eliminate the sale of internal combustion engines by 2035. That's a big step, from 2035. And again, don't imagine it just as 2035. I'm an economist by training, work back. Who's buying an internal combustion car in 2031? Because who are you selling it to in 2035? But do we have the infrastructure for that? What will that cost? I mean, this is my point about can emitters afford to pay? It's not just nations, but individuals. It's expensive to buy electric vehicles. Likewise, when it comes to shifting away from natural gas, which has been a large part of the UK's decarbonisation journey away from coal. We shut down our last coal-fired power station last month, I think, 6 weeks ago. So UK's coal source is now zero, and we were the first country in the world to generate electricity from coal. But then to move off natural gas gets into very complex questions about household energy delivery and heat pumps. And heat pumps, they're retailing at something north of $10,000, $12,000. But if you switch off the gas to the household, that's the choice they have to make. And that suddenly is, well, do you want to install heat pumps? Or do you want another teacher at your kid's school? And for me, that's what I think of as the big leads. And to some extent, that's great, because it means we're thinking much harder about the choices we need to make. It means we are moving into the stuff that will make significant difference to how we live. But it also means harder choices. Will people be able to fly in the same way they were able to fly before? Can you drive the same way you used to drive before? Or we have to make different choices and trade-offs. So I think for me, that's what the UK is both in a journey of political agreement on the change, but starting to hit some of the really complicated issues the new government has to face.
Thank you. Thank you for the question, Dennis. So we'll go online. And we have Ash Ramani. He says, Brit here, who used to live in Hawaii, tuning in from California State University. So we're going around the world here. Just like the UK, there's a problem of housing in Hawaii. And in the UK, loss of green areas to housing growth is an issue. And Hawaii, with its limited supply and loss of traditional knowledge through relocation to the US mainland, curious if there's a common issue in this, UK and Hawaii.
So this is another challenge the UK faces, because we have rising housing costs, which are making it harder for young people to access affordable housing. As the population gets older, they are hanging on to houses for longer and longer, so the housing stock is not recycling in ways that would be helpful. In the past, older people would move on and their 4-bedroom house is available for the next generation to come into and live close to the city centre. So we need to build houses. The government's committed to 1.5 million new homes to be built. And the question is where? Because some of that can be rehabilitating existing housing stocks. But the UK doesn't all want to live in tower blocks. I mean, it's an interesting emotional journey in the UK that people like their low-rise 2-bedroom houses. They're not interested in living in skyscrapers in the way that some, say, South Asian countries, that is the place people want to stay. And I think for me, that is part of how do you find this balance in this trade-off? Because it is always difficult. It's always easy to make large prognostications if you're deep in the climate journey. Say, we just have to stop building. Stop building, protect everything that's green. But if you can't carry your voters with you, then you don't stay in government long enough to make the other changes you need to make. And I think for me, that is what is the most complex part now we reach in the climate discussion, is how much give do we have to make to allow people to feel like they are seeing a beneficial change, but not being overly constrained from their way of living. And I always think this is perhaps a very personal view, perhaps more than just the UK government view, but I think the terminology of climate crisis can sometimes be difficult to translate. I mean, what does a crisis look like? If you're genuinely in a crisis and you are somebody who believes in that, have you stopped drinking coffee and tea because these things are massive drains on planetary resources? Have you stopped with the family pet because a Labrador emits about the same emissions as an SUV does every year? If you're saying to the public, we're in a crisis level response, the people talking about that have to be at a level of greenness that is almost impossible to sustain. But if we're able to talk to people about how can small individual changes make a difference? How can your actions around eating meat 3 days fewer in the week, or thinking about your travel journey more effectively, is something you can see and touch. You know, if I were to sort of, train to run an 800-meter race, you wouldn't put me up next to Usain Bolt and say, right, this is your practice target. And so I think, to my mind, that question around how does housing, how do you kind of create green spaces, is how do you find the right balance that allows people to see the benefits, but then still build in a sustainable way. We don't have to build the houses we built in the 60s, the ability to make those houses more energy efficient, greener areas, solar panels, all the things we couldn't do before. I think is a different kind of building approach than what we've seen today.
Oh, thank you for that. And thank you, Ash, for that question. And, I hear a lot of this balance, right? And interesting you're saying about language and terminology. We had this discussion at our international media conference on how do we report on climate. And that sometimes you look at the same story and can create everything into a crisis, which maybe could create a policy change that really impacts people's lives. So what is that balance? But that goes back to listening and understanding the environment and being careful about the language that we're using in catastrophizing. They say catastrophizing reporting, and that's that is a challenging space sometimes. So we'll go back in the audience here. Oh, here we have Consul General from Japan.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Paul. Long time no seen.
Yes.
We used to be in Malaysia together long time ago.
Old friends.
You're always you're always passionate and also so constructive and so sharp in your presentation. Thank you very much. That reminds us of the hard work just in Southeast Asia a long time ago. And Susie, thank you very much. This is a sort of wonderful, very important pressing topic we have to tackle. Two questions. One is common and differentiated principles, treatments. This is very important, I agree. At the same time, it's really so controversial recently. Those who emphasize common and those who emphasize differentiated. It's a sort of, in a way, sort of confrontation, some conflicts. Probably the UK, as a leader of all the coordination, not only climate change or any other issues, probably there should be some balance. How you just balance, especially the payments over the costs. Probably there should be some miracle principle or a miracle sort of formulation to allocate properly these costs for mitigation and adaptation. I would have sort of principles I would like to know. And then the other thing is a transfer of technology. This is also another thing which has become so difficult to balance. How do you balance the platform by those who strongly just claim the importance of intellectual property rights and also just a private people's initiative innovation, and those who strongly consider that there should be some sort of compulsory technology transfer to some of the countries or some of the companies. It seems to be a very difficult question, but the UK is a really miracle phenomenon, miracle formula, just so you have, I may think. So thank you very much. These are the questions. Thank you.
No, thank you, Valigar. Thank you. So let's start with technology first. And it's interesting because as an economist with an economics background, I often think about these challenges both through that lens of equilibrium and balance. It's perhaps why I use that word so much, very much about the ecosystem itself, as it balances. But also, how do you create the right incentives and the right journeys? And it's interesting, I mean, again, a bit of history. It's interesting in the UK, one of the reasons that the Industrial Revolution happened in the UK was because of our property rights. The same innovations were happening in continental Europe, but often the intellectual property belonged to the crown. So the king owned the intellectual property, and the king didn't always want new machines to weave wool because that would undercut the king's, sheep and herd and how it would all fit together. Whereas in the UK, because Parliament by this point was in the ascendancy, it assigned intellectual property rights to individuals who then knew they could take these forward, protect their inventions, and create wealth. And then the Industrial Revolution sprang up, and we can talk a lot about the coal and the climate journey since then, but the point is intellectual property matters. I think for me, that is the test of how do we get the technology out as quickly as we need it. Because, I mean, to your point, Susie, not to create the catastrophization of the problem, but we are up against the clock. You sort of think about, it's difficult in human history to understand what really big time frames mean. So we talk about ice core samples that are 2.7 million years old. That sounds pretty old to us. But on a planet that's 4 billion years old, it would be a bit like predicting the weather in 2025, when your entire knowledge base was like 7 p.m. to midnight on December the 31st. And so being able to think in big time frames matters, because some of this technology will take a long time to deploy. And not just deploy, but to be used. And when you think about, countries in the world just now, we worked a lot with Indonesia, for example, on kind of, managing its deployment of new coal energy. If you put down a new coal-fired power station, that could be a 30-year play on energy. So I think there's a balance to be struck between how we can support the innovators in technology, compensating them as necessary for technology that goes there, working hard to agree intellectual property rights, which actually benefit the countries too. I mean, no country works well in the long term by not respecting property rights. By and large, countries that allow rampant theft of intellectual property do not develop their own commercial ecosystems. They tend to struggle and suffer, because if my idea is going to get stolen, why would I work well? So you want the countries to have the technology, you want to support them to develop good intellectual property frameworks. But it might mean you have to compensate companies on the journey. I mean, we saw this any number of occasions in other fields. For example, in tackling disease in Africa, we came to different arrangements with drug companies to provide access to drugs in a low-cost, efficient way to deal with the HIV/AIDS pandemic. So for me, there is an opportunity to make that work. There's an opportunity to make sure that the financial compensation arrives, because you don't want to see the technology stolen. But it also does require that sense of urgency to get things up and running. And there are partnerships too here. I mean, working with my American colleagues over many years, there was concerns about Chinese intellectual property use and whether it was being, properly respected in China. But now China is some of the world leading in intellectual property development on batteries or solar. So now China itself has an interest in protecting its intellectual property. So there's a journey that allows everybody to kind of work together to solve the issue. And on the common differentiated treatment point, I think it comes back to this point about the individual ideas, individual island nations, and how everybody works together as well. Because each country can give according to its opportunity, but they also need to receive according to their need. And I think that nature of how you support commonality of approach, because we're all living on the same planet. And as I said, the planet doesn't care where that ton of emissions comes from. I mean, a mitigation in Angola is as good as a mitigation in Azerbaijan or in Denmark. But the point about how we then support the most effective and efficient way to mitigate from is absolutely key. And that's why, again, I very much support, as a British taxpayer and a British employee, that if I can mitigate a ton of carbon somewhere more cheaply elsewhere in the world, then that's where I should be using aid programs and aid spend to make that work. Not just thinking it has to happen at home and it has to happen in my backyard. It's different for nature preservation, that's different again. But I think in terms of the kind of CO2 emissions and mitigations, there's a different approach in the global context. And then with nature is another journey again.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the question and the response. And we'll go online now to Borhan Ashkin from Bangladesh. So we really are going.
Christ, yes, indeed.
Scotland, California, now we're Bangladesh. This is great. Join the East-West Center and you can go around the world. So Bangladesh is one of the vulnerable countries due to climate change. So developing countries demand more finances and grants rather than loans. At the same time, there has been no accepted definition of climate finance. On these grounds, how can diplomacy play a significant role?
Oh, so sorry, you're going.
Oh my.
Oh,
Okay. Thank you. Thank Anna to the rest.
Exactly.
So, okay, no, that's okay. So Borhan from Bangladesh. Bangladesh is one of the most vulnerable countries due to climate change. So developing countries demand more finances that are grants rather than loans. And at the same time, there's no accepted definition of climate finance. And on these grounds, how can diplomacy play a significant role in addressing this issue?
You could jump to a facetious answer and say it can't, to some extent. I mean, the 300 billion we agreed in Azerbaijan it's terrific. I mean, the money needs to be there. The money needs to be there. There's no question of that. Mark Carney, former governor of the Bank of England, when he was looking at his work around the Glasgow COP, suggested the needs globally to decarbonise are somewhere between $7 and $11 trillion. And that is enormously beyond the 300 billion. That's like the ante at a poker table. It gets you in the game, but you can't play too much with it. And so for me, when I think about, how much can diplomacy do, it can do some. I mean, we can bring together individuals and the kind of government action. But it's really, how does the financial sector, how does the commercial sector begin to engage on this journey and help to make it work? How do you mobilize trillions of dollars out there, which could be supporting effective mitigations and effective climate support? And it's an interesting challenge in places like Bangladesh because they face such extreme flooding risk. It can shut down their capital for days and weeks. It can have fundamental impacts on their businesses and their industry. But how do we support them? Because Bangladeshi businesses themselves want to stay operational. Investors who are investing in Bangladesh want their investments to pay off. So it's not just about what is the kind of governmental money, as you said, the loans that come in and the grants, but how are we enabling the private sector to take a bigger role and a bigger lead in these areas? And also critically, how do we enable local innovation? I mean, again, this comes back to this journey around local solutions, indigenous solutions and ideas. So when I was posted to India many years, a close neighbor, of course, of Bangladesh, I remember in Mumbai, there had been mangroves in Mumbai for many, many years. And the development came, and of course, they took down all the mangroves, and they built kind of lovely oceanfront property. And then storm surges, one particularly bad storm surge arrived and completely destroyed many of the barriers and the flooding that occurred along all the sort of human-made elements of the shorefront. But the mangrove areas were completely untouched because the mangroves are an enormously effective natural barrier to storm surges. So, of course, when we met with the colleagues in Mumbai, the government was now working as hard as it could to rehabilitate mangroves. Now, would somebody who is handing out a loan from the World Bank, I mean, the World Bank are smart people, of course, but somebody who's sitting in headquarters far away have figured that out? Or would you have been wanting to enable more local solutions to their journeys and supporting more grants? Because again, to my mind, this is not just about fixing the problem. There is a whole new generation of climate technology and climate industry that is coming. And as somebody who believes fundamentally in how we support and enable wealth across the world, I want to make sure that entrepreneurs in Bangladesh are innovating and taking advantage of climate technologies and new solutions. And to Kadama-san's point, getting the intellectual property rights to deliver that. And so I agree entirely with the idea that it's not about arriving with, the classic helicopter money to come in and give it to somebody to do a project that's been agreed somewhere far away. It's about saying, what are local conditions? What are local solutions? How am I creating local businesses to respond? How am I creating local entrepreneurs to come up with new ideas and new ways of thinking? Because that is how you access the $11 trillion we need, not just the $300 billion, as important as it is, that diplomats might have agreed in the conference.
No, thank you for that, and thank you for the question from Bangladesh. Makes me think about also the access to the climate finance that exists, that money. Often smaller countries that don't have capacity to know how to maneuver through the bureaucratic process of getting that money
Yes.
is a whole of society effort, not just diplomats. It's the folks that are providing that grant and providing those systems in place. So, those online, thank you for your questions. I apologize we couldn't get to your questions because we're going to go in person here with the last question. So thank you for those of you around the world who jumped on. But
Genuinely around the world. That's shows the East-West Centre has incredible reach. That's
yes,
really,
yes, we went from
you are East and West.
Yes, we really are. So we will have a question from in here. Okay, we have one back there. I'm sorry. Sorry, Dennis. Oh, maybe the. Okay. Oh, okay. Go ahead.
So sorry about that. I know.
Name and place first.
Yeah. My name is Nathaniel Wilson. I'm from Hawaiʻi Island, and my question was more about the UK's role in the Pacific. As East-West Center has hosted events with Germany, with industry leaders in both the America and the German industries with green transitions and whatnot, it come to mind about how your Jevons, and it's like a paradox of like the 21st century as we're making this green transition, we're also consuming more and more energy. And it made me wonder, is there a sort of trade-off between this green transition in the quote-unquote developed world versus in the developing world with the money being spent?
Yes. Okay. So if I think I understand the question correctly about this kind of trade-offs between the kind of, it is an interesting question. If I feel optimistic, on my optimistic days, I do think that humanity's got a great capability of getting itself out of a hole. I mean, genuinely, as like a kid, I thought the ozone layer had us all done before I turned 20. And there's a wonderful quote I remember from The Economist many years ago, and it was talking about peak oil. Remember, peak oil, that thing? And it had this great quote when it said, "The Stone Age didn't end because we ran out of stones." And I think that the carbon age will not end because we've run out of carbon. We'll just shift to new means and new mechanisms. There are challenges. I mean, those who have heard of the phrase greenflation, that we are simultaneously demanding more kinds of resources while at the same time restricting our access to them through mining permits and so on. I think that is a genuinely complicated question. Protecting a particular species in a mining area might be great for the species, but if the whole planet cooks, they're done for anyway. So there are genuinely hard questions and trade-offs about how quickly we move. But I think this is my point, again, to kind of come full circle, about being in the Asia-Pacific region, being in Oceania and working with, a kind of Hawaiian vision of how these things work, is it's easy in Britain to think about other choices because, we might be on an island, but there's a lot of island in Scotland, a lot of hills. You can all climb up them and avoid the rising tides. That's not true for many island nations here. They cannot wait for us to figure out the mitigation problem while they watch their livelihoods in their island literally evaporate around them. And so to me, I think that is where the trade-offs have to have a limit. We have to be able to say, yes, we are moving ahead and yes, we need to get things done, but it cannot come at the expense of those least able to raise their voice and least able to defend themselves. And frankly, that is, as a Brit myself, that is what British society is about, is about protecting those least able to defend themselves, defend for themselves. And I think from a global perspective, it is neither to sort of, talk about it in a sort of infantilizing way that, oh, they need our help, because that's not true. They need to enable themselves. They might need financial support, and they certainly have a climactic journey being imposed upon them, not through their own choice. But it's not about coming with our solutions. It's about it's almost like, like a sort of supporting their ability to solve their own journey. And I think for me, that's where the kind of trade-offs have to have a limit, that we don't just step over other people's journeys in our own path. But at the same time, that we recognize the incredible depth of skills and knowledge and understanding that may or may not be written down, it may or may not be in a kind of journal online, but nonetheless holds not just insights for their solutions here, but as Hawaii is an island, it is not just solving for problems to the west in the Pacific, it could be solving problems to the east in the Caribbean, or frankly to the islands of Scotland if you figure out how to do grid integration that works well for island communities. So from my perspective, I think that's kind of, if that's the right answer to your question, to say there are trade-offs that we will need to make globally. We cannot make these trade-offs to the point where communities are left abandoned. But the more we listen, the more we understand, there are 7 billion brains on this planet. There are lots of good ideas. I often feel in diplomacy the challenge is getting all of them around the table at once to have the right solution and conversation. But to kind of conclude here, Susie, to say that the chance to work with you in the East-West Centre, the chance to be part of the British government speaking to you here today, so many of our colleagues from around the world, that is how we solve. It's how we crowdsource solutions to the challenges we face together.
Well, thank you so much, Consul General Rennie. Do you have any other final before I close us out here?
No, just a huge thank you.
Well, thank you so much. And you have clearly showed us that the role of diplomacy in this very critical and difficult area is that so it's complex. But I see from where I sit is a bridge, a listener, creating partnerships, opportunities, and providing a voice for those who may not have a voice, providing ideas that informs policy. I mean, I heard a lot, and reminding us that there are difficult and hard choices that political, government leaders, and communities have to make. And so I really, really thank you for enlightening us, coming all this way, connecting us around the world, because while we bring people, it is the people who bring other people from around the world. So they came to hear you, not me. So whether they were from Edinburgh, whether they were from Bangladesh or California.
Particularly pleased with Edinburgh.
Oh, yes, of course. And I've been there. It's great. Great place. Want to go back. But But many thanks to our audience and here, many distinguished leaders who are in our audience today and community members, as well as those who joined us online. And again, I apologize for those of you who had questions and I couldn't get to it. And we really enjoyed today's presentation. And if you want to join us for future programming, please check us out at eastwestcenter.org/events. Sign up and you'll get it pushed to you. So listen, there'll be a lot more interesting presentations like the Consul General here. So mahalo nui loa and aloha.
Thank you.